I was holding my father's hand in a Colorado hospital room when the surgeon looked me straight in the eyes and asked me to make a choice that would change everything. My dad was dying, the surgery could save him, and I was the only one who could sign the consent forms. I approved the operation. My father died on that table, and now my own family has turned against me, calling me a murderer, saying I killed him for money and threatening to destroy my reputation in every way they can imagine. Please listen to my story and tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong, because I made a medical decision out of pure love and desperation, only to be accused of the most unthinkable crime by the very people who should have stood by me in grief. My father was 72 years old when his heart started failing. He had been a strong man his entire life, working construction in Denver for 45 years, never taking a sick day, never complaining about pain, but that strength meant nothing when his aortic valve began to deteriorate so rapidly that doctors gave him 3 months to live without intervention. The cardiologist explained that the valve was calcified and narrowed to the point where his heart could barely pump blood through his body. Every day my father grew weaker. Every day I watched him struggle to breathe while doing simple tasks like walking from his bed to the bathroom. I became his primary caregiver because I was the only child who lived nearby. My older brother Marcus lived in Texas with his wife and 3 kids, running a successful insurance business that kept him too busy to visit more than once every few months. My younger sister Rachel was in California, working as a marketing executive and constantly traveling for her job. She would call occasionally, always sounding rushed, always cutting the conversation short because she had a meeting or a flight to catch. My father never complained about their absence. He would smile weakly and tell me that his other children had important lives and responsibilities. But I saw the sadness in his eyes every time he asked if Marcus or Rachel might visit soon. When my father's condition worsened to the point where he could no longer live independently, I moved him into my home. My husband supported the decision completely, helping me convert our guest room into a medical space with a hospital bed, oxygen equipment, and all the monitors the home health nurse said we would need. We hired nursing staff to help during the day while I worked my part-time job as an administrative assistant at a local elementary school. But every evening, every weekend, every free moment I had was dedicated to my father's care. I learned to manage his medications, track his vital signs, and recognize the subtle changes in his breathing or color that meant something was going wrong. The doctors had been clear from the beginning about what would happen without surgery. My father's heart would continue to weaken until it simply gave out. He would likely die from heart failure or a massive stroke caused by the inadequate blood flow to his brain. The timeline was uncertain, but the outcome was guaranteed. Surgery was the only option that offered any hope of extending his life, but the surgery itself carried enormous risks. The doctors used terms like transcatheter, aortic valve replacement, and explained that they would need to insert a catheter through an artery in his leg, thread it up to his heart, and replace the damaged valve while his heart was still beating. The procedure was less invasive than open heart surgery, but for someone in my father's weakened condition, the risks were still significant. I attended every medical consultation. I took detailed notes. I asked questions until I understood exactly what we were facing. The lead cardiologist was a skilled surgeon named Dr. Peterson, who had performed hundreds of these procedures. He sat with me in his office for over an hour, going through the statistics and outcomes. He explained that patients in my father's age group and condition had approximately a 75% chance of surviving the surgery and recovering enough to return to a reasonable quality of life, but that also meant there was a 25% chance that he would not survive the procedure or would suffer complications that would leave him worse off than before. My father and I had many long conversations about the surgery during those weeks of decision-making. He was terrified of dying on the operating table. He told me about his fears of never waking up, of leaving us without saying proper goodbyes, of the pain and confusion he might experience in his final moments. But he was also terrified of the slow suffocation that awaited him without the surgery. He described the sensation of his failing heart as feeling like he was drowning from the inside, like his body was betraying him one breath at a time. He wanted more time. He wanted to see his grandchildren grow up. He wanted to attend my daughter's high school graduation the following year. He wanted to live. The decision became mine to make, officially, because my father had designated me as his healthcare power of attorney 5 years earlier. He had made that choice deliberately after my mother passed away from cancer. He told me then that he trusted me to make the right medical decisions if he ever became unable to make them himself. He said he knew I would honor his wishes and fight for what he truly wanted, not what was easiest or most convenient. At the time, I never imagined I would actually need to use that authority. I never imagined I would be sitting in a hospital conference room, signing legal documents that gave doctors permission to open up my father's body and try to repair his dying heart. The day we scheduled the surgery, I called Marcus and Rachel to inform them of the decision. Marcus was supportive but distant. He said he trusted my judgment and that he knew I was doing everything possible to help Dad. He promised to fly in for the surgery if his work schedule allowed it, but he made no firm commitment. Rachel's response was different. She questioned everything. She asked why we were rushing into such a dangerous procedure. She suggested we get second opinions, try experimental medications, look into clinical trials. When I explained that we had already exhausted those options, that multiple cardiologists had confirmed this surgery was the only realistic chance for survival, she became angry. She accused me of making unilateral decisions without properly consulting the rest of the family. She said I was being selfish and controlling. I tried to stay calm during that phone call with Rachel. I reminded her that Dad had chosen me as his healthcare proxy specifically for situations like this. I told her she was welcome to fly to Colorado and speak with the doctors herself if she had doubts about the medical necessity of the surgery. I even offered to schedule a family conference call with Dr. Peterson so everyone could hear the same information directly from the specialist. Rachel refused all of these suggestions. She said she was too busy with work, that she trusted Dad's doctors even if she didn't trust my judgment, and that she just wanted to be kept informed of any major developments. Then she hung up without saying goodbye. The surgery was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late September. Marcus did not come. He called the night before to say that a major client emergency prevented him from traveling, but that he would be thinking of us and praying for a successful outcome. Rachel sent a brief text message wishing Dad good luck. My husband took the day off work to sit with me in the surgical waiting room. My 2 teenage children wanted to come to the hospital, but I convinced them to go to school instead. I didn't want them to spend hours in that sterile waiting area, watching me fall apart with anxiety and fear. The surgery was supposed to take 3 to 4 hours. Dr. Peterson had explained the timeline carefully. They would need time to sedate my father, insert the catheter, navigate it to his heart, position the new valve, deploy it correctly, and then ensure everything was functioning properly before they closed up the insertion site and began the recovery process. I was prepared for a long wait. What I was not prepared for was the nurse who came to get me after only 90 minutes, her face pale and serious, asking me to follow her to a private consultation room. Dr. Peterson entered the room a few minutes later, still wearing his surgical scrubs. He sat down across from me and delivered the news in a gentle but direct manner. My father had suffered a massive stroke during the procedure. The stroke had occurred suddenly, likely caused by a blood clot that had broken free and traveled to his brain during the valve replacement. The surgical team had done everything possible to stabilize him, but the damage was catastrophic. My father was brain dead. The machines were keeping his body alive, but there was no brain activity, no possibility of recovery, no hope that he would ever wake up or breathe on his own again. I remember the way the room seemed to tilt and spin around me. I remember my husband's arms catching me as my legs gave out. I remember the sound of my own voice, a strange high-pitched wailing that didn't seem to belong to me as I realized my father was gone. The man who had raised me, taught me to ride a bike, walked me down the aisle at my wedding, held my babies when they were born, was gone. And I had signed the papers that put him on that operating table. Dr. Peterson was kind but honest. He explained that the stroke was an unpredictable complication, one of the known risks of the procedure, but not something that could have been prevented or anticipated. He said the surgical team had performed the valve replacement flawlessly, that the new valve had been positioned correctly and was functioning as intended when the stroke occurred. He emphasized that my father would have died within weeks without the surgery, that we had made the only reasonable choice given the circumstances, that no one could have predicted this particular outcome, but all I could hear was that my father was dead. All I could feel was the crushing weight of responsibility and guilt. I had approved the surgery. I had signed the consent forms. I had made the decision that ended his life. It didn't matter that the doctors said it was the right choice. It didn't matter that my father had wanted the surgery. All that mattered was that he was gone, and I was the one who had sent him to his death. We made the decision to remove life support that same day. The doctors confirmed there was no brain function, no chance of recovery. Keeping him on machines would only prolong the inevitable and deny my father any dignity in death. I called Marcus and Rachel from the hospital. I told them what had happened, that Dad had suffered a stroke during surgery and was brain dead, that we were going to remove the breathing tube and let him go peacefully. Marcus said he would try to get a flight that evening, but probably wouldn't make it in time. Rachel screamed at me through the phone, demanding to know what I had done, insisting that I had killed our father. My father died at 6:37 that evening, surrounded by medical equipment and strangers. I held his hand and whispered that I loved him, that I was sorry, that I hoped he knew I had only wanted to save him. My husband stood beside me, crying quietly, providing what comfort he could. My children came to the hospital after school and said their goodbyes to the grandfather they adored. But my siblings were not there. Marcus was on a plane somewhere over Kansas. Rachel was still in California, refusing to speak to me after our phone call earlier that day. The next few days were a blur of funeral arrangements, paperwork, and the administrative nightmare that follows any death. I planned the entire service by myself because Marcus didn't arrive in Colorado until the day before the funeral, and Rachel refused to participate in any of the planning. She claimed she was too devastated to function, too grief-stricken to make decisions about flowers or readings or burial plots. But she found the energy to call me every day and blame me for what had happened. Rachel's accusations started subtly at first. She would make comments about how Dad might still be alive if we had waited longer, if we had tried different treatments, if we had been more patient. She questioned my motives for pushing the surgery so quickly. She suggested that maybe I had wanted Dad to die so I could inherit his property and life insurance money. These statements were so outrageous and hurtful that I initially couldn't even process them. I thought grief was making her irrational, that she would eventually realize how cruel and baseless her words were. But the accusations didn't stop. They escalated. By the time of the funeral, Rachel had apparently shared her suspicions with other family members. I discovered this when my father's sister, my Aunt Linda, approached me at the reception after the service. She asked me pointed questions about the surgery, about why I had made the decision without waiting for Marcus and Rachel to see Dad one last time, about whether I had properly understood the risks. The implication was clear. She believed I had been negligent or worse. Marcus tried to stay neutral initially. He would listen to Rachel's accusations and then tell me privately that he knew I had done my best, that he didn't blame me for what happened. But I could see the doubt in his eyes. I could hear the questions he wasn't asking. And as the weeks passed, his support became weaker and less convincing. He started making comments about how he wished he had been more involved in the medical decisions, how maybe things would have turned out differently if we had all discussed the options together as a family. The real attack came about 6 weeks after the funeral, when my father's will was read. He had left his house and the majority of his savings to me. This was not a surprise. We had discussed his estate planning many years earlier, and he had explained that he was leaving more to me because I had been his primary caregiver, because I had sacrificed my time and energy to support him in his final years, and because Marcus and Rachel were already financially secure and successful. The will also included modest inheritances for Marcus and Rachel, along with specific bequests of sentimental items and family heirlooms. Rachel exploded when she heard the terms of the will. She stood up in the lawyer's office and screamed that I had manipulated Dad, that I had isolated him from his other children so I could control him and steal his money. She claimed I had rushed him into surgery knowing he would die so I could inherit everything before Marcus and Rachel had a chance to contest his estate planning. She called me a murderer, a thief, and a manipulative monster who had betrayed our father's trust. Marcus didn't defend me. He sat silently in his chair, staring at the floor, while Rachel raged and made her accusations. When the lawyer tried to calm Rachel down and explain that the will was clearly legitimate and had been signed years before Dad's illness, Rachel turned her fury on him as well. She announced that she was going to hire her own attorney to challenge the will and investigate the circumstances of Dad's death. She said she would prove that I had coerced or manipulated Dad, that I had made reckless medical decisions to speed up his death, and that I should be held legally and financially responsible for what happened. I left that meeting in a state of shock and devastation. My father had been dead for only 6 weeks. I was still drowning in grief and guilt, and now my own sister was publicly calling me a murderer and threatening legal action. My husband was furious on my behalf, telling me that Rachel's behavior was unconscionable and that I should cut off all contact with her immediately. But I kept hoping that she would calm down, that the intensity of her grief would fade, and that we could eventually find a way to reconcile. That hope was destroyed over the following weeks. Rachel began a campaign to turn other family members against me. She called my father's siblings, our cousins, and even some of Dad's longtime friends. She told them her version of events, painting me as a greedy and negligent daughter who had sacrificed Dad's life for financial gain. She claimed I had prevented Marcus and Rachel from being involved in his medical care because I wanted complete control over his treatment and his assets. She suggested that I had chosen the riskiest surgical option because I knew it was more likely to result in his death. Some family members believed Rachel's accusations. Others tried to remain neutral, but admitted they had questions about what had really happened. A few relatives actually called me to ask for my side of the story, but even those conversations felt like interrogations. I found myself having to defend the most painful decision of my life to people who had no medical knowledge, who hadn't been there during Dad's decline and who were willing to believe I was capable of essentially murdering my own father for inheritance money. The social isolation became unbearable. Family gatherings that I had always attended became hostile environments where relatives would whisper and stare. Some people stopped inviting me to events altogether. My children were affected as well. Their cousins, Marcus's and Rachel's kids, were told that I had done something terrible to their grandfather. The cousins stopped responding to texts and phone calls. The warm relationships my kids had enjoyed with their extended family evaporated almost overnight. Rachel's threats of legal action continued. She hired an attorney who sent me a letter demanding copies of all of Dad's medical records, all documentation related to my role as healthcare proxy, and detailed financial records showing how I had managed Dad's money during his illness. The letter also suggested that they were considering filing a wrongful death lawsuit against me, claiming that I had breached my fiduciary duty as healthcare proxy by approving an unnecessarily risky surgery without proper consultation with other family members. That letter was the breaking point for me. I realized that grief and anger were not going to make Rachel back down. She genuinely believed her accusations, or she had convinced herself to believe them because the alternative was accepting that Dad's death was a tragic outcome of an unavoidable medical situation. Either way, I needed to protect myself. I needed to defend my reputation, my relationship with my children, and the memory of the loving bond I had shared with my father. So I did this. I hired a medical malpractice attorney to investigate the circumstances of my father's death and provide a legal determination of whether I had acted appropriately as his healthcare proxy. I gathered every piece of documentation related to Dad's care, including medical records from multiple specialists, notes from every consultation, records of my communications with doctors and nurses, and financial statements showing exactly how I had managed his money. I also retrieved something that I had not told anyone about until that moment. 6 months before his death, my father had made a video recording where he explicitly discussed his medical wishes and his reasons for designating me as his healthcare proxy. The video had been my father's idea. He had asked me to help him record it one afternoon, saying he wanted to make sure his intentions were completely clear in case there was ever any confusion or family conflict after he was gone. In the video, Dad sat in his favorite chair in my living room and spoke directly to the camera. He explained that he had given me healthcare power of attorney because he trusted my judgment completely and knew I would honor his wishes even when the decisions were difficult. He stated clearly that if he ever faced a serious medical crisis, he wanted every possible treatment that offered a reasonable chance of extending his life. He said he was not ready to die, that he wanted to fight for every additional day he could have with his family, and that he authorized me to approve any surgery or treatment that doctors recommended as medically necessary. The video was devastating to watch after my father's death. Seeing him alive and hearing his voice made my grief feel fresh and overwhelming all over again. But the recording was also exactly the evidence I needed to prove that I had followed his explicit wishes when I approved the surgery. Dad had wanted aggressive treatment. He had wanted me to pursue every available option. I had done exactly what he asked me to do. My attorney reviewed all the documentation and medical records. He consulted with independent medical experts who specialized in cardiology and surgical outcomes. After a thorough investigation, he provided me with a detailed legal opinion stating that I had acted appropriately and responsibly as healthcare proxy, that the decision to approve surgery was medically justified and consistent with my father's expressed wishes, and that the outcome, while tragic, was an unfortunate complication rather than the result of any negligence or misconduct on my part. Armed with this legal opinion and the video evidence, I made a decision about how to respond to Rachel's threats and accusations. Now, this is where I did hire a medical malpractice attorney to prove my innocence, use my father's video testament to silence my family, and cut off all contact with my siblings that I want you to advise me if I was right or wrong. My attorney sent a comprehensive response to Rachel's lawyer. The response included copies of the independent medical expert opinions confirming that the surgery was medically necessary and appropriately recommended given Dad's condition. It included the video recording of Dad explicitly authorizing me to make aggressive treatment decisions on his behalf. It included financial records showing that I had managed Dad's money carefully and appropriately, never taking anything for my own benefit, and actually spending thousands of dollars of my own money on his care that was never reimbursed. The response concluded with a clear statement that Rachel's accusations were defamatory and completely without merit, and that if she continued to make these false claims publicly, I would have no choice but to file a defamation lawsuit to protect my reputation. I also sent copies of the video recording to Marcus, to Aunt Linda, and to several other family members who had been influenced by Rachel's accusations. I included a letter explaining exactly what had happened during Dad's illness, the medical facts about his condition and treatment options, and the impossible position I had been placed in as the person responsible for making life and death decisions. I didn't ask for sympathy or forgiveness. I simply asked them to watch the video and see for themselves what Dad had wanted and how I had tried to honor his wishes. The response from Rachel was explosive. She called me screaming, accusing me of manipulating Dad into making that video, claiming it was fake or coerced, insisting that it changed nothing about what I had done. But her attorney apparently saw things differently. Within a week of receiving my attorney's response package, Rachel's lawyer sent a letter withdrawing the threat of legal action. The letter stated that after reviewing the additional evidence, they had determined there was no viable basis for a wrongful death claim. Marcus called me after he watched the video. He was crying. He apologized for doubting me, for not defending me more strongly against Rachel's accusations, for allowing our family to be torn apart by suspicion and blame. He said seeing Dad on that recording, hearing him speak so clearly about his trust in me and his wishes for his own medical care, had made Marcus realize how wrong he had been to question my decisions. He asked if we could try to repair our relationship. I told Marcus I needed time. I appreciated his apology, but the damage from the past months had been severe. He had stood by silently while Rachel destroyed my reputation and tried to turn our entire family against me. He had allowed his own children to be poisoned against me and my kids. An apology couldn't immediately fix all of that harm. Rachel never apologized. After her attorney backed down from the legal threats, she simply stopped communicating with me altogether. She blocked my phone number, unfriended me on all social media, and made it clear through other family members that she considered me dead to her. She apparently could not accept that Dad's death was a tragic accident rather than my fault. She needed someone to blame for her grief and pain, and I remained the target of that blame even after all the evidence proved her accusations were false. The family fracture was permanent. Some relatives watched the video and reached out to express their support and apologize for believing Rachel's accusations. Others remained distant, either still unsure about what had really happened or uncomfortable taking sides in the family conflict. A few, including Aunt Linda, continued to maintain relationships with both me and Rachel, trying to stay neutral but ultimately satisfying no one. The impact on my children was the hardest part to watch. My daughter, who had been extremely close to her grandfather, struggled with complicated grief. She missed Dad terribly, but she also felt angry at me for a long time, even though she understood intellectually that I had made the right medical decision. She had heard Rachel's accusations and couldn't completely dismiss them, even knowing they were false. It took months of family counseling for her to work through those feelings and rebuild trust with me. My son took a different approach. He became fiercely protective of me and furious with Rachel and Marcus. He refused any contact with them or their children, saying he wanted nothing to do with family members who could treat his mother so cruelly during the worst time of her life. I tried to encourage him not to completely close those doors, but he was adamant. The cousins he had grown up with, the uncle and aunt he had loved, were all dead to him now because of how they had treated me. The emotional toll of the entire experience was devastating. I went through months where I questioned every aspect of the decision to approve Dad's surgery, even knowing that it was medically necessary, even seeing Dad's video where he explicitly asked for aggressive treatment, even having independent medical experts confirm I had acted appropriately. I still tortured myself with what-ifs. What if I had waited another week before scheduling the surgery? What if I had insisted on more tests? What if I had found a different surgeon or a different hospital? What if I had overridden Dad's wishes and refused to approve any risky intervention? My therapist helped me understand that this kind of magical thinking was a normal part of grief and trauma. She explained that our brains desperately want to believe we have control over tragic outcomes, so we create scenarios where different choices might have led to different results. But the reality was that Dad's heart was failing. The surgery was his only realistic chance at survival, and the stroke that killed him was an unpredictable complication that no one could have prevented or foreseen. Slowly, over many months, I began to find peace with what had happened. I accepted that I had made the best decision possible with the information available at the time. I accepted that my father had trusted me to make that exact kind of difficult choice on his behalf. I accepted that his death was a tragedy, but not a crime, an act of medical misfortune rather than negligence or malice. But I never found peace with what my family had done. Rachel's accusations and Marcus's silent complicity had caused damage that could never be fully repaired. They had taken the worst experience of my life and made it exponentially more painful by adding betrayal and public humiliation to my grief. They had forced me to defend myself legally and spend thousands of dollars on attorneys during a time when I should have been focused on healing and supporting my children through their own grief. The inheritance that Rachel had been so angry about became a source of bitter irony. Dad had left me his house and money because I had cared for him, sacrificed for him, and been there for him when my siblings were too busy with their own lives. But that inheritance came at a cost I never imagined. It cost me my relationship with my sister, damaged my relationship with my brother, fractured my extended family, and hurt my own children. No amount of money or property was worth that price. I eventually sold Dad's house because living there or even visiting became too painful. Every room held memories of his decline, of the medical equipment and nursing visits, of the desperate hope that we could keep him alive long enough for the surgery to save him. I used part of the inheritance to fund college accounts for my children and to make a substantial donation to the cardiac research program at the hospital where Dad died. I wanted something positive to come from his death, some contribution to medical knowledge that might help other families facing similar impossible choices. The relationship with my children slowly healed, though it was forever changed by what we had all endured. My daughter eventually told me that she was grateful I had been strong enough to make the decision about Dad's surgery, even knowing how badly it might turn out, even knowing I would be blamed if things went wrong. She said she hoped she would have that same kind of courage if she ever had to make similar choices for someone she loved. My son remained angry at Rachel and Marcus for years, though he eventually softened enough to exchange brief pleasantries with them at a distant cousin's wedding. I learned to live with the permanent loss of the family connections I had once treasured. Holidays became smaller and quieter, celebrated with just my immediate household rather than the large extended family gatherings I had grown up with. I stopped attending family reunions and events where I knew Rachel would be present, unwilling to subject myself to her coldness or risk another confrontation. Marcus and I maintained a polite but distant relationship, exchanging brief phone calls on birthdays and major holidays, but never recovering the closeness we had shared before Dad's death. The video recording that Dad made became one of my most precious possessions. I watched it occasionally when I needed to remember his voice, his face, his absolute trust in me. Sometimes watching it brought comfort, the reassurance that I had honored his wishes and done exactly what he asked. Other times it brought fresh waves of grief and guilt, the pain of knowing that my best efforts had not been enough to save him. 3 years after Dad's death, I attended a support group for people who had lost parents under traumatic circumstances. Listening to other people's stories helped me understand that complicated grief, family conflict, and misplaced blame were all sadly common experiences. Many people in the group had been accused of negligence or wrongdoing by other family members after a parent's death. Several had faced lawsuits or police investigations before being cleared. Nearly everyone described the same sense of bewilderment and betrayal, the shock of being attacked by the people who should have provided comfort during the worst time of their lives. The group facilitator explained that this phenomenon often occurred because families needed someone to blame when a death felt senseless or unfair. Instead of accepting that medicine has limitations, that bodies fail despite our best efforts, that tragic outcomes happen even when everyone involved makes reasonable choices, people search for fault. They construct narratives where someone must have made a mistake, must have been negligent, must have caused the bad outcome through their actions or inactions, and often the person who ends up carrying that blame is the one who was most involved in care, who made the difficult decisions, who was present at the end. Understanding the psychology behind Rachel's accusations didn't make them hurt less, but it did help me recognize that her cruelty stemmed from her own pain and inability to cope with loss. She needed to believe that Dad's death could have been prevented, that someone was at fault, that the tragedy made sense if only she could identify the villain. I was the convenient target because I had made the final decision, because I had been there when he died, because I had inherited the visible proof of Dad's love and trust. But I also came to understand that Rachel's needs did not obligate me to accept her abuse or maintain a relationship with someone who had caused such harm. Forgiveness, I learned, does not require reconciliation. I could acknowledge that Rachel was acting from a place of grief and pain while still maintaining firm boundaries that protected me and my children from further damage. I could release my own anger and resentment while still recognizing that our relationship was permanently broken. By the 4th year after Dad's death, I had built a new life that felt stable and meaningful, though different from what I had imagined. My career had progressed. My children were thriving in college and high school, respectively. My marriage had survived the strain of the trauma we had endured together. I had developed close friendships outside of my biological family, creating a chosen family of people who knew my story and supported me without judgment. I sometimes wondered if Rachel ever reconsidered her accusations, if she ever watched Dad's video again with clearer eyes and recognized how wrong she had been. I wondered if she felt any regret for the damage she had caused, for the family relationships she had destroyed, for the suffering she had added to an already unbearable situation. But I never knew, because we never spoke again after that final screaming phone call when I sent her the legal response. Marcus occasionally mentioned Rachel in our brief conversations, letting me know that she had moved to a new city, changed jobs, or experienced some other major life event. But he never suggested that she had softened in her views about me or expressed any interest in reconciliation. As far as I knew, she still told anyone who would listen that I had killed our father for money. The fact that this narrative had been thoroughly disproven by medical experts, legal professionals, and Dad's own recorded words apparently didn't matter to her. The permanent estrangement from Rachel meant that my children had no relationship with their aunt or their cousins on that side of the family. Family events that once brought us all together, weddings and graduations and baby showers, became awkward negotiations about who would attend and who would stay away. Usually I stayed away, unwilling to create drama or discomfort for the person being celebrated, unwilling to risk confrontation with Rachel in public settings. This cost became particularly painful when my daughter graduated from high school and later from college. Rachel did not attend either celebration, and her children, who had once been close to my daughter, sent only brief impersonal text messages instead of participating in the festivities. My daughter tried to act like it didn't matter, like she was fine celebrating without that part of her family, but I saw the hurt in her eyes. I saw her scanning the crowd at her graduation party, looking for cousins who didn't come, an aunt who chose to treat her as collateral damage in an adult conflict. My son got engaged during the 5th year after Dad's death. When he and his fiancée were planning the wedding, they had to navigate the complicated question of whether to invite Marcus, Rachel, and their families. My son's initial instinct was to invite none of them, maintaining the boundaries he had established years earlier. But his fiancée, who came from a close-knit family herself, encouraged him to at least reach out to Marcus, to offer him the opportunity to attend if he was willing to come without drama. Marcus accepted the invitation and came to the wedding. He was polite and appropriate, carefully avoiding any mention of Rachel or the conflict that had fractured our family. He congratulated my son warmly and told me during the reception that he was proud of how my children had turned out, that Dad would have been so happy to see them thriving and building their own lives. It was a bittersweet moment, a reminder of what our family could have been if grief and blame hadn't destroyed it. Rachel was not invited to the wedding. My son made that decision firmly and never wavered. He said he was not willing to include someone who had treated his mother so cruelly, regardless of shared blood or past relationships. His fiancée supported the decision completely, and so my sister was absent from one of our family's most joyous occasions, the gap in the family circle visible to everyone who knew our history. I thought about my father often during the wedding celebration. I wished he could have been there to walk with me down the aisle as mother of the groom, to dance with my new daughter-in-law, to give one of his famously emotional and rambling toasts. I wondered what he would think about the family fracture that had occurred after his death, whether he would be angry at Rachel for her accusations or heartbroken that his children had become permanently estranged. I hoped he would understand that I had tried to honor his wishes, that I had fought to protect his legacy and the truth about our relationship, even when that fight cost me so much. The video recording of Dad made one final appearance during my son's wedding weekend. After the rehearsal dinner, when the family had gathered at our house, my son asked if he could show the video to his fiancée, who had never seen it. We all watched together, my son and his bride-to-be, my daughter and her boyfriend, my husband and I, as Dad spoke from beyond the grave about trust and difficult decisions and the bonds of family. There was something healing about sharing that recording with the next generation, about letting them see the man Dad had been and understand the impossible situation I had faced. My future daughter-in-law cried as she watched, and afterwards she hugged me and said she couldn't imagine having to make such a devastating choice. She said she hoped she would handle it with as much courage and integrity as I had if she ever faced something similar. Those words meant more to me than she could have known. After years of defending myself, of having my motives questioned and my character attacked, of losing family relationships because of a decision I made out of love, hearing someone simply acknowledge the difficulty of what I had endured felt like a gift. It didn't erase the pain of the past years, but it reminded me that I had done my best in an impossible situation, and that some people could recognize and appreciate that truth. Looking back now, 6 years after my father's death, I can see that the decision to approve his surgery was both right and wrong, simple and complex, justified and tragic. It was right because it followed his explicit wishes and gave him the chance at survival that he desperately wanted. It was wrong only in hindsight, knowing that the outcome was death rather than the extended life we had hoped for. It was simple in the sense that the medical facts were clear and the choice was straightforward. It was complex because no life or death decision is ever truly simple, because the responsibility of making such choices is crushing, because the consequences of being wrong are unbearable. The decision to fight back against Rachel's accusations, to hire attorneys and gather evidence and defend myself publicly, was similarly complicated. Part of me wished I could have simply absorbed her anger and accusations, allowing her grief to run its course without engaging in the conflict. Maybe if I had stayed silent, if I had let her blame me without defending myself, the family fracture would have eventually healed on its own. Maybe time and perspective would have softened her anger without the need for legal letters and video evidence and formal rebuttals. But I know now that staying silent would have been impossible. Rachel's accusations were not just private expressions of grief shared within the family. She was actively working to destroy my reputation, to turn relatives and friends against me, to paint me as a murderer who had killed our father for financial gain. She was threatening legal action that could have resulted in me losing the inheritance Dad wanted me to have, facing criminal investigation, or being publicly branded as someone who had committed elder abuse or medical negligence. Defending myself was not optional. It was necessary for my survival, for my children's well-being, for the protection of my father's true legacy. The video recording that proved I had followed Dad's wishes, the medical expert opinions that confirmed the surgery was appropriate, the financial records that showed I had managed his care ethically and responsibly, all of that evidence was essential to stopping Rachel's campaign of blame and preventing lasting damage to my life. The cost of that defense was the permanent loss of family relationships that I had valued my entire life. Rachel would never forgive me for proving her wrong, for demonstrating that her accusations were baseless, for taking away the narrative that helped her make sense of her grief. Marcus, despite his apology, would always carry some measure of guilt and discomfort about his role in the conflict, making our relationship forever strained and superficial. Extended family members who had witnessed the accusations and counter-accusations would always see our family through the lens of that conflict, even those who ultimately supported me. My children paid perhaps the highest price for my decision to defend myself aggressively. If I had absorbed Rachel's blame quietly, maybe they could have maintained relationships with their aunt and cousins. Maybe they could have grown up with the extended family connections that I had enjoyed in my own childhood. Instead, they inherited a fractured family where holidays were negotiated carefully, where weddings required strategic invitation lists, where entire branches of the family tree had been severed. My daughter told me once during a late-night conversation in her first year of college that she struggled with feeling like she had lost her grandfather twice. First, she lost him to death when the surgery failed. Then she lost him again when the family conflict destroyed all the relationships and traditions that had kept his memory alive. She couldn't attend family gatherings where people shared stories about Dad because those gatherings no longer included her. She couldn't look through old photo albums with her cousins because those cousins no longer spoke to her. The grief for what had been lost extended far beyond Dad's death itself. But she also told me that watching me stand up for myself, watching me refuse to accept false accusations and public humiliation had taught her an important lesson about self-respect and boundaries. She said she had learned that sometimes protecting yourself requires choices that are painful, that sometimes doing the right thing means accepting permanent consequences, that sometimes you have to fight even when fighting guarantees that relationships will be destroyed. I didn't know if that lesson would serve her well in her own life. Part of me wished she had learned softer lessons about forgiveness and family loyalty and the importance of maintaining relationships despite conflict. But those lessons only work when all parties are acting in good faith, when everyone is willing to acknowledge mistakes and work toward reconciliation. Rachel had never been willing to do that. She had chosen to construct a false narrative and cling to it despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. No amount of patience or forgiveness or family loyalty on my part could have changed her fundamental choice. The question that haunted me most deeply was whether my father would have approved of the aftermath of his death. He had trusted me to make difficult medical decisions, but he had also valued family unity and harmony. He had always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who smoothed over conflicts and encouraged his children to forgive each other's flaws. Would he have wanted me to defend myself so aggressively if he had known it would lead to permanent estrangement? Would he have preferred that I accept Rachel's blame, sacrifice my own reputation and peace of mind, if it meant preserving some possibility of family reconciliation? I would never know the answer to those questions. But I had to believe that Dad would have understood why I made the choices I did. He had given me power of attorney because he trusted my judgment in crisis situations. He had made that video recording specifically to protect me from exactly the kind of accusations that Rachel ultimately made. He had structured his will to recognize my years of caregiving, knowing it might cause resentment from my siblings, but believing it was fair and appropriate. My father had trusted me to do what was necessary, even when what was necessary was painful and difficult. Approving his surgery was necessary because it was his only chance at survival, and it honored his explicit wishes. Defending myself against Rachel's accusations was necessary because allowing those false claims to stand would have destroyed my life and damaged my children. Both decisions were impossible in their own ways. Both decisions had consequences that would reverberate through my family for generations. But both decisions were, I believed, ultimately right. The medical community's response to Dad's case provided some cold comfort. After his death, the hospital conducted a standard review of the surgery and its outcome. The review board concluded that the surgical team had performed appropriately, that the stroke was an unpredictable complication rather than the result of any error or negligence, and that the decision to recommend surgery for a patient in Dad's condition was medically sound. Dr. Franz Peterson sent me a personal letter after the review, expressing his condolence and reiterating that everyone involved had done everything possible to save my father's life. That letter, along with the independent medical expert opinions I had obtained during the conflict with Rachel, made it absolutely clear that Dad's death was a tragedy but not a preventable one. The surgery carried risks, but those risks were outweighed by the certainty of death without intervention. The stroke that killed him was a known possible complication, but not one that could have been predicted or avoided. My decision to approve the surgery was, according to every qualified medical professional who reviewed the case, the correct decision given the information available at the time. This medical consensus should have ended any reasonable person's doubts about what had happened. But Rachel was not operating from a place of reason. She was operating from a place of grief, anger, and a desperate need to find meaning in senseless tragedy. No amount of expert testimony or video evidence could penetrate that emotional fortress she had built around her version of events. I sometimes wondered if Rachel's accusations stemmed partly from guilt about her own absence during Dad's final months. She had been too busy to visit regularly, too focused on her career to participate in his care, too distant to be present for the crucial medical consultations. Maybe blaming me was easier than confronting her own regrets about not being there, not being involved, not saying proper goodbyes before the surgery. Maybe attacking me allowed her to avoid examining her own choices and their consequences. Marcus's initial failure to defend me likely stemmed from similar guilt. He had promised to be there for the surgery and then canceled due to work obligations. He had left me alone to bear the full weight of the decision and its aftermath. Supporting me would have meant acknowledging his own absence, his own failure to share the burden of caregiving and decision-making. It was easier, at least initially, to remain neutral and let Rachel's accusations create doubt that obscured his own shortcomings. Understanding the psychological mechanisms behind my siblings' behavior didn't excuse it, but it did help me stop taking their actions as personal attacks. They were not cruel people by nature. They were people who had handled grief and guilt in destructive ways, who had allowed their own pain to justify inflicting pain on others, who had chosen the comfort of blame over the difficulty of acceptance and forgiveness. I tried to feel compassion for them, though I was not always successful. Some days I could recognize that they were suffering too, that they had lost their father and then compounded that loss by destroying their family relationships. Other days I felt only anger and resentment toward people who had made the worst time of my life exponentially worse through their selfishness and cruelty. My therapist encouraged me to work toward what she called radical acceptance of the situation. This didn't mean approving of what Rachel and Marcus had done or pretending it hadn't hurt me. It meant accepting the reality that they had made their choices, that I couldn't change those choices or their consequences, and that I needed to focus on building a life that felt meaningful despite the losses I had suffered. Radical acceptance was harder than it sounded. It required acknowledging that I would never get the apology I deserved from Rachel, never have the sister relationship I had once treasured, never see my children connected to that whole side of the family. It required letting go of fantasies about future reconciliation and accepting that some damage was truly permanent. It required making peace with ambiguity and unanswered questions, with never fully understanding why my siblings had handled the situation the way they did. But slowly, over years of therapy and reflection and grief work, I did find a kind of acceptance. Not happiness about what had happened, but a calm recognition that I had survived something devastating and come through it with my integrity intact. I had made the best decisions I could with the information I had. I had honored my father's wishes and defended his legacy. I had protected my children from false accusations and taught them by example about standing up for truth even when the cost was high. The inheritance that had been such a source of conflict became, eventually, a source of meaning. I used Dad's money to fund scholarships for nursing students at the local community college, supporting young people who wanted to dedicate their careers to caring for others. I made donations to cardiac research and surgical training programs, hoping that future patients might benefit from advances that could prevent the kind of stroke that killed Dad. I helped my children with college expenses and down payments on their first homes, passing along the financial security that Dad had worked his whole life to build. These choices felt like ways of honoring Dad's true values. He had always believed in education, hard work, and taking care of family. He had lived modestly despite having the means to spend more lavishly, preferring to save for his children's and grandchildren's futures. Using his legacy to support those values felt right in a way that simply keeping the money for myself never could have. My relationship with my husband deepened in unexpected ways through the crisis we had weathered together. He had seen me at my absolute worst, drowning in grief and guilt and rage, and he had never wavered in his support. He had held me through countless sleepless nights. He had defended me to relatives who questioned my choices. He had helped me gather evidence and prepare legal documents. He had reminded me repeatedly that I was a good person who had been placed in an impossible situation, that Dad's death was not my fault, that surviving the aftermath with my integrity intact was an achievement worth celebrating. I often thought about what might have happened if I had not had his support during those dark years. Would I have been able to withstand Rachel's accusations without his constant reassurance? Would I have had the strength to fight back, to gather evidence and hire attorneys and defend myself publicly? Would I have been able to model resilience and self-respect for my children if I had been facing the crisis alone? I didn't know the answers, and I was grateful beyond words that I had never needed to find out. My children's resilience amazed me. They had experienced trauma and loss at young ages, watched their family implode, seen their mother attacked and vilified, and somehow they had emerged as compassionate, thoughtful adults. My daughter chose to pursue a career in healthcare ethics, directly inspired by the impossible medical decisions she had witnessed during Dad's illness. She wanted to help families navigate these kinds of crises, to provide guidance and support when people face choices between terrible options. My son became fiercely committed to protecting the vulnerable and speaking truth to power in his own career as a civil rights attorney. He said watching me fight for justice and truth in the face of false accusations had shown him the importance of standing up for what was right even when the personal cost was devastating. He represented clients who had been wrongly accused, who faced overwhelming institutional pressure, who needed someone willing to fight for them when everyone else had given up. I was proud of who my children had become, even as I grieved for the innocence they had lost. They should have been able to mourn their grandfather without the added trauma of family warfare and public accusations. They should have been able to maintain loving relationships with their extended family. They should have been able to trust that the adults in their lives would handle grief and conflict with maturity and grace. But they had learned different lessons, harder lessons, lessons about human nature and the ways that pain could make people cruel. Those lessons would serve them well in their adult lives, even if I wished they hadn't needed to learn them so young. 6 years after my father's death, I received an unexpected message from one of Rachel's children, my niece Emma, who was now in college. She reached out through social media to say that she had been thinking about what happened after her grandfather's death. She said she was old enough now to understand that the situation was more complicated than she had been told as a teenager. She asked if I would be willing to talk with her, to share my perspective on what had really happened. I agonized over how to respond. Part of me wanted to refuse, to maintain the boundaries I had established and avoid reopening old wounds. Part of me wanted to use the opportunity to tell Emma exactly how her mother's accusations had damaged our family, to make sure she understood the truth about her grandfather's death and my role in his care. Part of me simply wanted to connect with this young woman I had once been close to rebuild a relationship that had been a casualty of adult conflict. I decided to meet with Emma, but I approached the conversation carefully. I didn't bash Rachel or try to turn Emma against her mother. I simply told her the truth about Dad's illness, the medical facts about his surgery, and the evidence that proved I had acted appropriately as his healthcare proxy. I showed her the video recording of Dad discussing his wishes and his trust in me. I explained how devastating it had been to be accused of causing his death when I had been trying desperately to save him. Emma cried as she listened. She apologized for believing her mother's version of events without question, for cutting off contact with me and my children, for not reaching out sooner. She said she loved her mother, but was beginning to understand that Rachel's grief had made her act in ways that were neither fair nor reasonable. She asked if there was any way to repair the damage that had been done, to rebuild family connections that had been severed. I told Emma honestly that I didn't know. The damage was extensive and some of it might be permanent. But I was willing to have a relationship with her, if she wanted that, to get to know her again as the adult she had become rather than the teenager she had been when our family fractured. I couldn't promise anything about relationships with Rachel or the broader family, but I could offer Emma the truth, my time, and my willingness to try. That conversation with Emma opened a small door that had been closed for years. She began visiting occasionally, meeting me for coffee or lunch, sharing stories about her life and listening to mine. She met with my children, her cousins, and began tentatively rebuilding those relationships as well. She said she hoped that someday she might be able to help facilitate some kind of reconciliation within the broader family, though she understood that might never happen. I appreciated Emma's intentions, but tried not to invest too much hope in the possibility of family reconciliation. Rachel had shown no signs of softening her position. Marcus remained polite but distant, unwilling to push for anything more substantial. The extended family had largely moved on, accepting the fracture as permanent and adjusting their own relationships accordingly. Expecting that years of estrangement could be easily undone felt naive at best and emotionally dangerous at worst. But Emma's reaching out did remind me that healing could take unexpected forms. Not every wound could be fully healed, but some damage could be partially repaired by people willing to seek truth and build bridges. The next generation didn't have to inherit all the conflicts and resentments of their parents. Young people like Emma could make their own choices about relationships and family connections, could question the narratives they had been told, and seek more complete understanding. Now, 6 years removed from the worst of the crisis, I lived in a state of what I called peaceful resignation. I was no longer actively grieving my father, though I missed him and thought of him often. I was no longer consumed by anger at Rachel or disappointment in Marcus, though those feelings surfaced occasionally. I was no longer fighting to prove my innocence or defend my reputation, though I remained vigilant about protecting the truth of what had happened. I had built a life that felt stable and meaningful despite the losses. I had work that I found fulfilling, relationships that sustained me, and children who were thriving in their own lives. I had made peace with the complicated truth that doing the right thing sometimes meant accepting devastating consequences, that loving someone deeply didn't always protect you from being blamed when they died, that family bonds could fracture irreparably under the weight of grief and guilt and accusation. The question I had asked at the beginning of this entire ordeal still remained unanswered in any absolute sense. Was I right or wrong to approve the surgery that led to my father's death? The medical professionals said I was right. The legal experts said I was right. My father's own recorded words said I was right, but Rachel would say I was wrong, and some family members would always harbor doubts, and I myself still questioned the decision in my darkest moments, despite all the evidence supporting it. Perhaps that uncertainty was simply part of making life or death medical decisions. Perhaps anyone who faced such choices would carry some measure of doubt and second-guessing regardless of the outcome. Perhaps the burden of that responsibility was knowing that you did your best with imperfect information, knowing that tragedy could strike despite your best intentions, knowing that some people would blame you regardless of the facts. Please tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong to approve the high-risk surgery, use my father's documents to clear my name, and walk away from my blaming family, because this decision didn't just end a medical crisis. It cost me the father I adored, turned my siblings against me for years, destroyed relationships between my children and their cousins, and left our family so fractured that my niece Emma didn't reach out to hear the truth until she was old enough to question her mother's narrative. And I'm sure Rachel won't be inviting me to her daughter's graduation this year.